Hello and welcome to the Australian Roundtable podcast, coming to you live from Brisbane, Australia. It is Saturday the 15th of November, and this is special episode number 2 of the Australian Roundtable podcast due to the G20, which officially kicked off today. And all going well, we will also go live tomorrow night with a comprehensive review of the event. Of course, we had our first special episode last night. We'll get back to that in a moment. Now, if you're new to the show, this is a roundtable discussion podcast covering Australian and international affairs, and we normally broadcast live from 4 p.m. Brisbane time every Sunday. I'm your host, Johnno, and I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by my co-host, Ethan Nash of TOTT News. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
And once again, it is our tremendous privilege to be joined by our resident historian, Lindsay. Glad you're here, mate.
Yes, I'm very pleased to be here too. Thank you for that.
Now, I should point out that in our weekly broadcast, we try to be relatively structured, but tonight, given that we've been out in the field all day, tonight will be a little bit more off the cuff and just having a general discussion, recounting what we observed in the field today. But we do have a basic rundown of the kind of things we'll discuss tonight. We'll talk about the pre-march rally in the CBD this morning. We'll talk about the march through the CBD itself. We'll talk about Obama's speech at the University of Queensland, not far from where we sit, and his motorcade before and after. We'll talk about the police behaviour throughout the day. And then we'll also get into a general discussion about the protest movement, the intellectual resistance movement, whatever you want to call it, our thoughts based on what we saw today. Because, of course, for those who haven't been listening to our podcast leading up to the event, today was really supposed to be the day of protest regarding the G20. Now, we have a bit of a tradition on the show. We do like to quickly discuss our favourite newspaper, the newspaper of the year, according to them, the Courier Mail. And I did buy a copy today, guys, really quickly. Ice, Cold War, Putin and Abbott, still front page news. But now the Courier Mail has really devolved into self-parody. On the front, they've got what looks like a Russian bear wearing a hat with the hammer and sickle and a boxing kangaroo. And I think they are just taking the piss now, surely. I mean, this is the one newspaper that you can buy in this city, and that is supposed to pass for something approaching intelligent. Oh, look, I can't even talk about this anymore. I'm throwing this thing on the ground. There we go. That's our Courier Mail segment.
Good riddance.
Now, let's move on to the proper discussion. The pre-march rally. So the background to this is that this morning, a number of groups were supposed to be getting together at a set spot in the city, in the CBD. It had all been okayed by the police. It was supposed to be a peaceful, civil rally that would start with speakers and what have you, and then a march through the city to Musgrave Park. Yeah. Now, all three of us turned up by 9 o'clock because there was supposed to be a pre-rally march. I think that fizzled out. Ethan, you can tell us more about that in a moment. And then we had the proper rally. And I'll jump straight to you guys. From 9 o'clock, Lindsay, from the time you got there, do you want to share with the audience some of your thoughts about what happened?
Well, I was a bit surprised that there were so few people there at that time. But there were a group setting up loudspeakers, and there were some people dressed in canary yellow and white trousers. And they turned out to be, was it Falun Gong?
Falun Gong.
Falun Gong. And I'm really impressed with them. They were doing like Tai Chi type exercises, and I was, and they were well organised, yeah, and banners and the whole bit. Whereas everybody else seemed to be a bit slack and, just doing it. But the people with the loudspeakers and what have you had set up right in the middle of the forum area. It's a bit like a coliseum or whatever, and they'd taken the ground there, and then people gradually rolled in slowly. So that's about all I could say about it.
Yeah, well, I think the same. We all showed up together, thinking that at least the organisers would be there at the time, and it seemed like it was a pretty dismal crowd when we got there, and we just went and sat down, and there really wasn't much except to see the larger percentage of the audience, were those people practicing their, Tai Chi, sort of protesting with their banners and whatnot. But it was a good at least hour and 15 minutes before people actually started to roll in. And most of the crowd that was getting there were police officers that were getting set up. So I was thinking to myself, when is this going to pick up? This certainly isn't all that there is.
Yeah, and there'll be people tuning in who are familiar with what happened in Toronto 4 years ago. Of course, we've discussed this a lot, and we thought that the protests here might be somewhat similar, either in terms of the protesters or the police response. And some of our listeners might be saying, well, hold on, are you saying that at the protests in Australia, in Brisbane, on the Saturday, on the big day, there was almost no one there? Yes, that is what I'm saying. We turned up at 9, as was supposed to happen, and the Falun Gong people were there, and they probably had 50 or 60 people, possibly more, all dressed in what essentially was a uniform, the yellow shirt and the white, I don't even know what you call those pants. White slacks, yeah. All doing their Tai Chi together. They also had their own organisers who were standing off from them to deal with the media, to deal with police liaisons, whatever. A very well-organised outfit on one side of this big open field. And this is in the CBD. I don't know, perhaps hard to describe. It's on a hill in the CBD, so perhaps you could fit, if you had a full crowd, you could probably fit many hundreds of people there. On one side, you had Falun Gong doing their thing. On the other side, you had what we eventually found out was one of the indigenous groups who were holding their protests. However, at 9 o'clock, there was just a Falun Gong there. So at the start of the day, on the biggest day of G20, outside of a group of Chinese dissidents, if you want to call them that, we can discuss who Falun Gong are later. There was no protest as of 9 o'clock, the time that all the groups had agreed was the time to start getting together. That's what I'm saying. Would you guys agree with that basic summation?
No, that's right. Yeah. And I was surprised too, because I'd heard that it was going to be 11 o'clock. And it just there weren't that many people, and it just got closer and closer to 11, and I couldn't see anybody organising anything. And then the Indigenous group started, they had a number of speakers who were really hammering. I won't go on to that yet, but they were really pushing their bandwagon. And then Ethan then said, well, they had their march yesterday. And I hadn't realised that had been the go. So I don't know what this was today.
Yeah, no, it was really confusing. And, we obviously spoke last night. We concluded what the People's Summit, our thoughts about the week, and we made our prediction for tomorrow. And we said we didn't know what to expect, and that was one of the last things I expected, was to show up and to see such a dismal crowd. Even with the people that I talked to saying we're going to get there early so we can all get together and network and plan what we're going to do, we got there early and there was hardly anyone there. And it was weird, because this was the biggest day of the G20, man.
Yeah. And it's probably worth giving a background for some viewers who might not have listened to last night's podcast. Throughout the week, this week, there was the People's Summit, which was essentially the activists or the potential protesters doing workshops and giving lectures about their opposition to G20 and informally planning what they were going to do for G20 proper. Of course, G20 officially started today. So the People's Summit, we thought, went off well, but had poor numbers. Perhaps looking back, we should have predicted, if the People's Summit, which was well organised, had such poor numbers, how was today, which was so poorly organised, ever going to have good numbers? But the point that we're making is, and we'll get to the rally itself once it did slightly pick up in numbers, but in the lead up to the rally, there was almost no one there. There was no opportunity for there to be any protest clashes with police. There was really no need for the police to even, not that it's the police's fault, I mean, they were always going to be there, but there was really no need for there to be there at all, because there were almost no protesters to have to watch. That's how dismal the turnout was up to 11 o'clock and even beyond the official start time.
And it did eventually begin to pick up. The estimate numbers were about 3,000 people, 3,500 people from what the official mainstream media says during the entire march. And you could see it as the park started filling up more towards the time to march. It was really starting to fill up with protesters, but then the pre-march speeches weren't going down well at all, and it was just a really confusing situation. And it was exactly what we predicted about unorganized, they're not together. It's not, they're not as one.
No solidarity.
They're divided amongst each other. The solidarity is not there. So how is that going to resonate then into a physical march? And it came out into it.
Well, I'll tell you what, we've discussed the lead up to the official rally. So now we'll get into discussion of the actual rally itself. So fast forward to 11 o'clock, the pre-rally and march didn't take place. They fizzled out. So we get to the official one that had been planned in advance from 9 o'clock through the city. It had police okay. And what do you have but two different groups? The Falun Gong maintained their half of the park, and they had their own loudspeaker, and Channel 7 News, whatever, went and interviewed them separately. It was almost like a music festival. You know, sometimes they put the two stages side by side and you go and choose your, that's kind of what it was like, except that they were 100 meters apart. So even that, they were sort of talking over one another. On the left-hand side, looking from the place where I was stationed, because obviously I wanted to be outside of the police line. You guys were inside the police line. On the left-hand side, you had Falun Gong. On the right-hand side, you had what turned out to be an Indigenous group-dominated rally or speech or lecture series, whatever you want to call what happened. With that being the background, let's spend a few minutes from both of you giving the audience your views on that 15, 20, 30-minute diatribe that the audience was subjected to. Lindsay, what did you think?
Okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, I've got to admire them in that they had the loudspeaker and they took the high ground in the park so that nobody else could really dominate them. So they got there early and they did that. So we can't really whinge about that. I mean, if the people running the G20 march had the same degree of organisation, they would have been there earlier. They would have got up early. You know, the early bird catches the worm. So I really don't hold anything against them. But what my problem was, it was a haranguing, and it was a divisive thing. You know, that all the things that we've suffered, and it's you white people, and you know, and it went on in this vein, and that really isn't conducive to bringing people together against the G20. That was my view. Now, it may be more appropriate on another day, at another time, or whatever, but I really think that even though they pushed their own way, their own bandwagon, they got their way, I don't think it did the G20 march any service at all.
Look, most of our listeners are either from Australia or from countries that were colonised by the British, and most of these countries do have their own issues with the Indigenous populations. For those who aren't familiar with Australia's situation, basically colonised in the late 1700s by the British, and ever since then there has been this tension between Indigenous and the white settlers, and that tension remains to this day. And essentially, today, those Indigenous groups were almost the only voice outside of the Falun Gong leading protests. So of all the different protest groups there might be, it was only the Indigenous Australians with their gripes against the establishment that dominated proceedings. But not just that, it was a very narrow range of their own critique that was dominating the protests, Ethan.
Yeah, and each speaker was different. Each speaker had different opinions, different views, and they were just there was no plan to it at all, from my estimation. I do agree with you. Good on them for getting up and showing their voice. And, you know, elders know me, and I've spoke with elders. I've been to Musgrave Park. I've supported their rallies in the past. It's nothing against them in terms of the struggle that continues on today and the atrocities they've faced in the past. But my estimation was, or my observation was, that, you know, you have you had your march yesterday. This is a G20 march. That was my original thoughts at the start. Like, they were speaking good. You can have your speakers there. But as it continued on and it just become more and more dominated with this sort of, you know, very narrow spectrum of all of the G20 issues that were there, I was saying to myself, you know, this is a G20 march. We need, you know, to diverse ourselves and understand who the real enemy is. And a lot of these speeches were directed at dividing us amongst ourselves, as you said, Lindsay, that they don't associate with Australian people, that, you know, white people are responsible for this and that and this and that, and each sort of speech diverse. And it was just, in my estimation, it was doing less for the movement than it did for progressing it.
Very divisive.
Yeah. And there's no doubt that the Indigenous groups of Australia and their supporters have every right to feel aggrieved. I mean, if you look at the basic metrics of their life expectancies, incarceration rates, literacy rates, all the rest of it, there's no question that the Indigenous peoples of Australia generally are not doing as well as we. In fact, some of them, on some metrics, are some of the worst off people on the planet, and that's within a very developed nation. So they have every right to feel aggrieved. My issue with what happened today was that almost none of the speakers who got up there had any interest in providing any solutions or talking about how we can work together as a people. It was all about hating on the white man. Now, that is so non-constructive as to be destructive. It's destructive to any protest movement. Most of the audience were white people. And here is the people leading the non-Falun Gong protests saying that you are responsible for the problems that we face. And not just that, we're going to sit here for 5 minutes and talk about how bad our lives are and blame you in the audience for it. This is not to criticize any individual speaker, but if you're looking at a protest movement, whatever goals you're trying to achieve with the protest movement, you're not going to achieve them by putting up speakers who can't articulate their thoughts very well, and whatever their thoughts aren't aimed towards a solution. It's just having a diatribe against the very people who are there to support you. For me, it was absolutely absurd.
And there was a bit of language too. quite a bit of bad language dropped in.
Well, I'll tell you what, our audience, I mean, this is a Saturday night show.
Yeah.
Do you want to paraphrase some of what you heard?
Oh, you know, it's the usual effing cunts and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. You know.
Speaking directly about the white man.
Yeah. Saying that, I even heard F the white man screamed emphatically into the mic that the cars you drive, you know, they were built by the white man this, the white man that. And I was, you know, there was people there that were anti-capitalist. There were people there from different countries such as Mexico and Latin America that were showing solidarity with Latin America. There was all these different groups there that were there because the G20 leaders are here. And the only thing that we got was a bunch of Indigenous speakers who had every right to be there, but then they just dominated the entire speaking, and only a few speakers got in to speak about different issues. That to me is not constructive. That to me, for all my protest experience, is not going to help the movement at all, and it's not going to get any message across that we are, as a humanity, and we are against the system and some of, you know, the oppression of this tyranny, this global tyranny. You know, it's not one specific issue. It's every issue is under a bubble, but all the bubbles are in one big bubble, and that's not what was resonating.
I mean, I guess if we can try and you know, articulate our own thoughts here were the problems with what happened. One, that one group dominated. It'd be the same as if Anonymous were running the whole thing and didn't let anyone else talk. It'd be the same as if the Socialist Alternative were dominating and didn't let anyone else talk. The same as if the Greens were dominating. One group dominating and not letting another group talk. That from the start isn't good. Secondly, it was an Indigenous group who've already had an entire day yesterday, and they also led the charge on the Monday. So here's a group who've already had several bites at the cherry, then again leading on the biggest day on a Saturday. But then even if they're going to do that, to then attack their fellow peasants, that's what we all are. Us in the bottom 85, 90%, we're the peasantry. To then attack the peasantry rather than the top 1% or 0.1% or 0.01%, who we're all there to protest against because it's G20. I mean, that's just 3 points off the top of my head with what was wrong. But then it got worse because the speakers that they had, even if you think it's okay for one group to dominate, even if you think it's okay for that group to be a group that's been dominating all week, even if you think it's okay for them to then attack their fellow peasants, at least have some good speakers. These weren't even good speakers. These were just people up there to tell the world how much they hated their lives and how much it was the fault of the people in the crowd. It was ludicrous.
And Lindsay was there with me, and he was hearing all my thoughts at the time.
So what happened from that point? Once the crowd started getting bigger, and actually I should point out, in the crowd, the majority of people holding signs were holding signs that were this is my observation or your observations here. They were either about Indigenous issues like deaths in custody or give back our kids or whatever, or about climate change. I would say, as a rough guess, of the small placards or posters that I saw in the crowd, I would guess maybe 70 or 80% as a minimum were about those two issues, either Indigenous issues or climate change issues. So the myriad other things like finance, like banking, like corporatization, all of these issues were essentially ignored even by the crowd. Such was the domination of these issues in the days and weeks and months leading up to the so-called protests. What did you guys notice in the crowd?
I agree with you there. I did see a few others. There were some people who had posters on the ground or in front of them or whatever about South American issues, and there were a few others as well. But yes, they weren't speaking. If you had to wander past and have a look down where they were holding their placards to be able to see what that was about. So by and large, it was Indigenous issues or the angels with the feathers, you know, about Eddie Cole and
climate change. That's climate change. Okay, did you see a single placard or poster about the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
No, but I did hear a speaker who got hold of the microphone towards the very end before I left was starting to talk about that.
Yeah, her name was Sam. And
was it?
Yeah,
okay.
She was a good speaker. She come out and she actually had control of the mic, and you know, I was speaking with her all week in the Citizen Media Centre, and you know, it was a fantastic speech. I gave a round of applause. It was fantastic, but that was, you know, there needed to be more of that. That's what needed to be fiddled throughout the entire thing. But to come right at the end, just as we're about to rally, put in a few there.
So no placards for the TPP and one speaker. Let's look at other issues like the bank bailouts. Yeah. Did you see anything about bank bailouts or about the Australian bank bail-in?
No,
nothing about that. Did you see anything about the concentration of media and media power over politics?
No. Nothing about that either.
Did you see anything about the Syrian or Iraq war?
No, I didn't see that.
Now, these are just a few topics off the top of my head that not even the people in the audience seems to care about. I mean, that's how narrow people's fields of
Yeah.
attention have been made, and we can talk about that why that is later. But the point I'm trying to make here is that is what the biggest day for protest that this city has seen in a long time. The best that we could muster was terrible organisation. The people who took over the organisation, in my opinion, doing a terrible job, and then the audience themselves being a very self-selected group from a narrow field of concern, where there is so much concern to be had.
Yeah, can I interrupt for a minute? I'm down on King George Square, which is maybe a couple of 100 yards down the road. There were people down there, and I didn't go down and have a look. So, but I was told by somebody else that they were anti-Putin and pro-Putin people. So, and I don't know if there were anybody else down there. There may have been people talking about banks or whatever down there, but I didn't see that.
Yeah, well, this was the main march. There was a lot of sub-selective marches happening throughout the city, but this was the main march that was organised by Bruce Can, that all of these affiliated groups agreed that they were going to go to, and you saw them everywhere. But then, as we said, only a select group took the mic, and then you didn't see anything. I saw it was just a very selective group of people that, most of them probably weren't aware of these issues. We saw a couple, like the people that I spoke to at the G20 Peoples Summit about transnational corporations. They were there saying trying to get rid of transnational corporations, and there was, signs about Israel and whatnot. And there was a couple of good little things in there, but the majority.
I saw one sign about Israel, and just for the fact that there was one guy, I thought I'll go pop over there and say good on you for not having a placard about one of the other two issues. And he said to me, thanks for coming and complimenting me. Other people have been attacking me. So he said that, like, not attacking him physically, but other people have been walking past and saying nasty things to him. So the one guy that I saw in the crowd who even had a placard that had things like the Star of David on it, the other protesters were giving him shit for not being like, I mean, that's what he told me. I didn't see that while I was with him. But
no, well, I stood not far from him, and there were other people coming, taking photographs and giving him the nod and whatever. So
good.
I don't think it was all bad.
Yeah. I can just repeat what he said to me. The point is, though,
well,
if I can, I'll finish on this because we need you to tell us about the march, Ethan. But my observation of the rally was that it was, for all the reasons that I've given, pathetic, and that's why I decided to leave to get back to see the cavalcade for Obama, which I'll touch on later in the show. Obviously, Lindsay, you were left towards the end of the rally as well. Ethan was the one who stuck around for the actual march through the city. So do you want to spend 5 or 10 minutes now telling us about the march itself and what you observed?
Yeah, well, the march eventually did kick off, and the police started all going onto the road and forming their line that we had to be in between, and the police started coming out of the woodworks, and there was a lot more than was originally, you could originally see while the speakers were happening, and they were just on either side of the lane. And so the march began, led by the Indigenous people. The Indigenous people were at the front, where all the media were covering. Yeah. The media were at the front covering, and all you could hear was the Indigenous issues. So again, there's this diversity, but they have every right to lead the march. I'm not attacking them. I haven't been attacking them the whole time. This is a G20 march. So immediately from the get-go, there was problems because there was so much media. There's people from the New York Times, all of these international journalists and whatnot were there. There were so many journalists that to get a photo, as I was trying to, you'd have to get all these journalists in the shot or go past them to the front to try and get the people. And then the media liaison officers, as I expected, because I was told this from the Indigenous March, were pushing people back and not allowing enough time to get photos because we had to give room to the protest. So straight off the bat, there was already problems on the media side because this liaison officer, not just independent media, but mainstream media too, get back. That's it. You've got your photo. I was pushed multiple times throughout the rally saying, I'd stand there and wait for the camera to focus, and then I'd get pushed in the sternum saying, "Nah, that's enough. You've got your shot." And I'm saying, I've covered protests in this city for a long time. I know how to cover protests, and right from the beginning there was already trouble, and it was so hot. But the march, when it got on the road, it was massive, and the Indigenous people were stopping and doing their, native dances within the middle of the street, and eventually I ended up within the middle half to, with transnational corporations and whatnot, to film a diverse section of the crowd. And down there were no media liaison officers, so I didn't really have much trouble in that regards. And the police down there were really nice. I only got told by a couple of people, you know, you're a couple steps out of the line. You know, there was a few rotten eggs in the basket, but most of them were pretty good, and the march was pretty good for a normal Brisbane protest. In terms of a Brisbane protest itself, that was massive. But, you know, this is a G20 protest, and it just felt like it was the same old march that we've experienced time and time again. So right from the get-go, media problems, but then everything did settle down. The only problem was the heat. And so we, as it progressed, we went across the bridge and everything. We came across the bridge and ended up in a little tiny park right there, and the people were giving out free water and everything, and there was more dances and whatnot. And then we moved, and as we were going down, there was another protest coming into the T intersection. As we were approaching from the right, they were coming straight up, and they were Ethiopians talking about atrocities from the US that have been committed in Ethiopia and whatnot. And they stopped in the middle of the road, and we were still coming. There's about 3,000 of us coming, and the police were telling them to move on, but most of them could not speak English, so they didn't understand. And then when we eventually got to them, they were chanting at us, believing that we were pro G20, and they were telling us not to support the G20. And we were trying to say back to the Indigenous elders were saying we don't support them. And then there was all this commotion, and then the police started pushing everyone because the media were getting in there to get these shots, because these Ethiopians, their placards were pretty hardcore. They had children with their heads cut off and everything on these big placards saying, you know, they were saying, down with USA, you know, shame, shame, and thinking that we're supporting them. So they were being pretty hostile towards us. And then the Indigenous elders, they finally got the message across that we support them. And then we all started chanting together. And then the police were still pushing everyone all over the place, because by now the TNS section had got just packed because we've just been T-boned by this rally. So then the Ethiopians just join our rally, and it gets even more chaotic because now the road's not big enough to host both of us, and it was just so hot. But in terms of the entire rally, any problems, any police brutality, any police response that was unjustified, there was none at all, which was a big surprise to me.
A couple of questions for you. The Ethiopians, what was their number? How many numbers were there in their group?
There was about 30, I'd say.
So Falun Gong had something like, what, 40 or 50 or 60? It's hard to know the numbers. The Ethiopians had something like 30.
Yeah.
So they were really the two most organized groups on the day. And of course, Falun Gong, for people who I don't know if Falun Gong are big in other countries, but in Australia, we hear about them every now and again because it's a way to demonize the Chinese Communist Party. But basically in the late 90s, the CCP started cracking down on this Falun Gong group because they're seen as like a spiritual, independent of the state group. If they get too big, they're a potential threat to the CCP. That's why they started cracking down on them in the late 90s. And then to this day, their practitioners still practice outside of China. And the Chinese Communist Party doesn't recognize them. And that's why they were protesting China being at the G20. That's why Falun Gong were there. Ethiopia had the reasons that you've given. So two of the biggest protesting groups at G20 were essentially protesters from other countries. I mean, what does that say about us?
I got cornered by one of the ladies. I was just passing past the Falun Gong people, and one of the ladies got me. And she'd come up from Sydney, and she was their media liaison. And she started asking me about the sale of organs, body parts, and did I know anything about it from China? And I was quite interested in that because I've heard about Israel selling Palestinian body parts. And so I asked her, were they involved in that? It was no. It was a separate thing. The Chinese were getting foreigners to come into China to take these body parts, or presumably operated on and whatever. So that was interesting. I hadn't realised.
Did she give you like a pamphlet or any?
I've got it in my bag somewhere.
Okay. Well, we should probably go over that and try and get background for it for tomorrow's show if there's any meat to it.
But it was just interesting because I didn't know what they were about, and then I came away afterwards thinking, it's all about body parts from China. But obviously that's not they're a spiritual group.
Well, the Falun Gong, that's what they would claim. And certainly what we saw this morning, there was people practicing what looked like Tai Chi. I mean, they didn't seem threatening to anyone. I think the reason why the Chinese Communist Party find them a concern is because they depend on totalitarian control. It's more than 1 billion people in that country. It's a very large country. There's many disparate, essentially China is made up of many different cultures of its own, all under one big umbrella. So the notion that a big movement might take hold, that's a potential threat, and that's why they cracked down on the Falun Gong. But the Falun Gong there this morning were no threat to anyone.
No.
Did they take part? This is my second question for you, Ethan. Did the Falun Gong take part in the march through the city?
Yeah, they did. They were one of the back groups. Some of the foreign groups that ended up at the back, and I was observing them from the bridge because I was towards the back of the march at that time, and they were so organized. There was 4 in a row, and behind them they were in groups of 4, just in lines, lines behind each other, on group in 4s with their banners, which looked like they were just appropriate sizes from the way that the laws have been structured. And they were there, and they were still peaceful and practicing sort of Tai Chi methods as they were marching. So they were taking place in the march, and they made up a majority of the back was a sea of yellow.
So you're marching through the city. This has all been okayed by the police. They would have been flanking you on either side, I'd imagine, right through the intended course. In the city itself, non-protesters, what were the numbers like in the city to observe the protests?
It was a ghost town.
Yep.
Yeah. As we said, the Brisbane's a ghost town. People have fled Brisbane. There was hardly anyone. It was just a few people on the corners with their phones out, and then that was essentially it. It was just completely empty. We were the only ones in the city, it felt like, and that was very unique.
So basically, as we kind of touched on yesterday in our predictions, in the city there were 3 groups: the protesters, the police, and the media. Yeah, we knew how many police were going to be there. It was easy to predict how many media members were going to be there. The only one that we weren't so sure about was protest numbers. Now, you say that in your opinion there was 3,000 protesters taking part in the march.
Yes.
You make it all the way to Musgrave Park, which we said was going to be the hub, or we thought might be the hub for protests overall. Once that around 3,000 got to Musgrave Park, which is on the other side of the river for our non-Brisbane listeners, how many stuck around at Musgrave Park?
There would only be a couple hundred that stuck around.
So after the march that had been planned in advance, when it actually got to trying to be some sort of community at a static location, you reckon there were a couple hundred people who stuck around?
Yeah.
On the biggest day of the G20 here in Brisbane, Australia.
Yeah, right near the convention centre.
And of course, which group had kind of taken over Musgrave Park right from the start to make it essentially their home for the protests?
The same Indigenous activists that had taken over the speakings at the start.
Lindsay, what do you think of all this?
I sympathise with these people getting there and doing a bunk, because I left. I got to about 12:30, and I thought, this protest is supposed to be, the march is supposed to be going at 11 o'clock. I don't think they're ever going to go. And I was getting hot and bothered in the sun, so I just went home. And so I imagine it'd be something similar. They finally get to the other side of the city, and they think, well, what am I going to stand around and eat for?
Yeah, and there was only a few tents there in Musgrave Park. Most people would it was so hot. It was so hot in the city. It was upwards of 37 degrees today in the city, and it was that's degrees Celsius for some of our international listeners, and it was just humid, sticky heat. It was just a Brisbane day, and I've experienced protesting in that before, but this was just, because of the confinement that we had, usually you can spread out. When you're covering a protest, you can spread out and jump on, buildings and whatnot to try and get your great shots. We were confined, all of us, together in between the police lines that formed a lane. So we were all up against each other, and when we'd stop for them to do their dances, it was even hotter. So, but apart from that, as I said, the march went through well. Everyone ended up at Musgrave Park. Most of them left, and then there was just dances and Indigenous, songs and bands performing and food and everything, which is, great. Good on them. And that's their spiritual land there. That's what they associate with. So, they do have every right to speak there about their land. But it was definitely not what I expected.
And I think that was the thing. We talked about this last night. It looked like it was going to be disorganised, and I think it fulfilled our expectations. It really was disorganised.
The impression that I got today, and I'm going to spend more time over the next little while looking into who funded certain groups, but it almost seemed to me as though if you wanted to make sure that there wasn't a cohesion amongst the protesters and the different groups, people like myself have a huge aversion to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for one example. Other people might have a huge aversion to the concentration of media. Other people might have a huge aversion to this matter or that. The easiest way to make sure that they don't come together as a unified force would be to give the lead role of the protest to a group who aren't the best at being inclusive of other protest groups. And it almost seemed to me, whether it was by accident or design, the archetypal way to make sure the resistance to your G20 is no kind of resistance.
Yeah.
Did you get that impression today?
Yeah. And we've been talking about this, and it's too late now to organise it. But once you've seen this happening, you think, well, in the future, I mean, we could be organising a better job than that. I know that sounds arrogant, but it's true. At least you organise something and you work out what you're going to do. Yeah. Whereas, to me, that was anyway. I won't go on running them down, but it just seemed totally disorganised, and you can't succeed against 6,000 police.
Well, yeah. Well, in March, we had the March in March, and for some of our interstate listeners or some of our international listeners, it was a series of marches in opposition to the Abbott government that we currently have in place. And there was the March Australia, March Brisbane subdivision that organised it, and those rallies had 18, upwards of 18,000 people. They were bigger than the Vietnam protests, bigger than the Brisbane protest. The March in March was probably the best protest that I've ever been to, and then it was followed up by the March in August, somewhat, later in the year, which is a little bit smaller, but still made an impact. And those events went off really well with a lot of different speakers, with a lot of different ideologies, with a lot of groups, because it was organized like that. It doesn't matter what you have against the Abbott government, come out and we work as a cohesive unit to say we are opposed to this government and any government that tries to, suppress the people and, commit all these atrocities, come out and do it. And that proves that Brisbane has been able to put together rallies that have been bigger and more organised. And why wasn't that the case today during the biggest event that Brisbane could have ever had?
Excellent question. Why wasn't that the case?
Yeah.
And that's something for us to ponder over the next few days and weeks and months. And look, that's not just for us to ponder. The next G20 is taking place in Turkey. The one after that, I understand, has been given to China. Now, the Chinese one, who knows what's going to happen there, but we know in Turkey, and we can cover this in a future episode, it wasn't so long ago they had massive protests, genuine protests that could affect change. Of course, there was that, what was it, like a tent city that the Turkish put together using social media. They completely outflanked the police and the establishment forces. That was in Turkey not so long ago. They've got a protest in a year. They've got a G20 in a year or so. Well, hopefully the leaders of their protest can learn from this. It's not simply a matter of being organised. It's making sure that whoever is organising is trying to be as inclusive as possible, because the moment you get an element that's not there to be inclusive, the whole thing can turn to pus very quickly.
Definitely. Well said. And it was just, I don't know, I've just got conflicting feelings about the day. And for someone who's been at protests for 3.5 years in this city, it just seemed like we had the potential to really make our voices heard, and that was just abandoned through the division that's always existed in Brisbane, and poor organising / and that's not to bag BrisCan. BrisCan did an incredible job with the People's Summit, setting up the media centre and everything, but from that, it was the people's responsibility to be the ones that showed up and whatnot.
And there might be some listeners saying, well, Johnno, Ethan and Lindsay, if you know how to organise a protest, why didn't you do it? Well, let me respond to that really quickly if I can. My plan for this whole weekend was to cover it as a citizen journalist because of what had happened in Toronto. And my fears were that some similar things might happen, and the more people who were covering it, the better. Had I had any idea of who was going to be in charge of the protests, I would have done things very differently. That's my fault for not finding out. Who were the exact elements who were in charge of the protests? What were their agendas and so forth? You're right, that was my mistake. What difference would I have made as an individual? Not much. And this is the greater point I want to make. It wasn't just the people who were organising the protests. Look at who was in the crowd and what are they focused on. We as a people, we as the intellectual resistance, or the wannabe intellectual resistance, we as people in Brisbane who think that we're aware and want to make change, well, what are we concerned about? If we're all concerned about climate change and Indigenous issues and nothing else, well, then it doesn't matter what any 1 or 2 or 3 people try and do at the top. You know what I mean? In many ways, they're going to be reflective of the group of people. And really, my concern with what happened today, it's not a matter of just the organisers of the protest. It is the people of this country in general. If we genuinely think that climate change action should be the biggest thing that we're concerned about, if we genuinely think that deaths in custody of one subset of society rather than just the police state itself, if those are our biggest concerns, 2 problems. one, clearly we're focused on the wrong things, but two, why? Why do the progressives or the intellectual resistance in this country think that they're the biggest issues, and who's influencing them?
Yeah.
The problem goes far, far deeper than the organisers of the protest today. And that was what, look, I've noticed this slowly as I've been getting more and more into looking at who organises things in this city and in this country over the last year or two. It's become more and more apparent to me. But today it crystallised in my mind. The whole intellectual resistance, as I call it, has been co-opted. It real and truly has, and that was never more clear to me than today. So I know a lot of our listeners like to tune in because we like to try and be perky and happy and have a laugh, and normally we do. If I'm not coming across that way tonight, I do apologise. It was a big day in the sun. It was a long, hot day, and I'll discuss later how much time I spent with our friends, the boys in blue, later on in the show. But if we're having an honest, open discussion, we're trying to do that with this roundtable. For me, today was a disappointing day, and there's no way I can sugarcoat that.
Yeah. Well, you came home and gave up looking at the thing and got a protest placard and went back again.
Well, okay, we'll get to that. So far, all we've discussed is the pre-march rally, the march itself, and then how the march fizzled out. Obviously, Ethan, you covered the march itself, and if people go to TOTT News over the coming days, you'll have footage, you'll have articles.
Yeah.
Your coverage will be as good as anything anyone will find on the internet.
Yes.
I left the rally itself because I just couldn't stand what I was hearing and decided to come back to St. Lucia, where, of course, Barack Obama was giving a speech at the University of Queensland. Now, I rendezvoused with you, Lindsay, at my place, and we got to watch. I saw his motorcade go down the street. I saw the lemmings lined up on the street getting ready for the motorcade. I didn't stick around for that. I went to my house and got there just in time. Obviously, between me leaving that road, which is just near my house, and getting to my house, he'd come through and he got straight up on stage and gave his speech. It ended up being a 40-minute speech that Obama gave to all the people in this theatre at UQ. Tomorrow and over the coming days and weeks, we'll spend more time looking into that speech because there was a lot of stuff there to discuss. But just in 5 minutes or so, Lindsay, can you give us your basic thoughts on the speech that Obama delivered today, a kilometre from where we sit?
Yeah. It actually reminded me a little bit of Bush Senior when he came to Australia and on the airport, I think it was in Sydney, and started laying the law down to us. And it was almost shades of that. He came here and he stuck it, whether you agree with Abbott or not. I mean, I don't have a lot of time for Abbott, but he stuck it to Abbott and undermined Abbott's global warming, whatever you like, climate change or whatever. Now, and in doing so, that one of the things that got me was that I looking at him, he's talking about climate change, and then he flipped over into what the youth could do and what the governments could do, and there was no connection between the two. There was no offer of proof or anything like that. It was this assumption that yes, we've got climate change, therefore we're going to have to do things with emissions or whatever. And I thought, no, this is not. It's not logical. It was almost like a magician, you know. They just jump from and confuse the watchers. I was upset about the youth too. He started appealing to the youth directly to override their elders. Yeah, and that upset me. I went home and got out my trusty protocols again, and there it is. It's in there and telling you exactly how you do that.
Well, you've got your passages highlighted. Please.
Do you want me to do that now?
Please.
But yeah, I wasn't sure whether it fit in with what. Okay. And in number.
All right. So while you're doing that, I'll give the background here. So Lindsay reads widely, and I would hazard a guess that you've probably read hundreds of books in the last few years alone.
Yeah.
And one of the books that you like to refer to is The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, as you mentioned last night and at one of the public forum recently, it's not a matter of who wrote this book. What matters is that it was written more than 100 years ago, and the number of things that it forecasts or forewarns or plans, the number that have come to pass, in your opinion, makes it a significant book, regardless of who wrote it.
Right,
that's the background. Now you want to read out a passage from the book.
Yeah. Okay, this is number 9, and there's a passage in here. We have fooled, bemused, and corrupted the youth of the Goyim. That's the non-Jews. By rearing them in principles and theories which are known to us to be false, although it is that they have been inculcated. That's the one. And then there's the next one was, in this way, by inculcating in all a sense of self-importance, we shall destroy among the Goyim the importance of the family and its educational value, and remove the possibility of individual minds splitting off for the mob handled by us. Will not let them come to the front, nor even give them a hearing. Now, that when I heard that speech today, that was reminded me of that. I thought, here they are, they're saying, don't take any notice of your elders.
Yep.
Listen to us.
Yeah. In fact, if I can paraphrase what Obama said, it was that, old people are too invested in their old ways. They're too invested in old technology. It's up to you, the youth, to do things differently.
Yeah.
And he used that as his segue to launch into action on climate change and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In other words, anyone who told you that this isn't good for you, they're just out for themselves.
Yeah.
You guys have to do what's good for you, and let me tell you what that is.
Exactly. No, that's, you put it perfectly. Yeah. And I've never seen anybody gloss over this Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, after the last few days, I realise now that's a real cover-up phrase too, because it's not a partnership at all. It's a free trade agreement, which is
Orwellian double speak. Classic.
Yeah. Anyway, but he came in with that, and it just glossed over it completely. And it was a wonderful thing, and how it was going to give everybody jobs. There was no mention of the fact that corporations would come in and sue your government, and therefore you wouldn't have any control over your own government anymore. All that sort of thing. Anyway, but it I don't know who wrote it for him, but it really did sort of slick over this stuff and appeal to, well, I suppose the sycophants. They were all down there, thinking he was wonderful. I couldn't believe it, because what I listened to, I thought, there's no substance to this bloke. But they were all down there lapping his feet.
Big time. Ethan, obviously you got home well before I did today. Did you manage to catch any of his speech on replay or read what he said?
I saw it briefly. I saw a little news clip about it, and just how responsive the UQ audience were to him, because it was an invite-only event that had been, the tickets have been gone for months, and you could see that it wouldn't have been the most diverse group of intellectual speakers, in my opinion, that were going to be in there. And then as soon as he mentioned climate change, everyone was, just blindly, woo, it just seems like the way that Obama, and it was designed like that. Obama, as a puppet president, was there has been trained for a reason, because he has the power to, hypnotize people when he speaks. And people need to understand this. He can hypnotize people by relating to them, by being the cool president, by, using language keys. There's a lot more depth to this actor than people understand. And the UQ audience were just loving it.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. At the same time, though, I've been following Obama since he got into the presidency, even during his nomination for the Democrats. Back when I used to believe that politics, when you're young, you first start out and you actually think there's a difference between the parties. So most of us fell for that trick when we were young. The problem is that most people don't grow out of it. Once upon a time, I actually thought there was a difference between Republican and Democrats. And so this was back early when I was following politics. I happened to be following Obama at the time. And I have to say, after 6 or 7 years in the job, he's not really putting that much effort in anymore. I mean, really, he gets up there. He doesn't even pretend that he's not reading from the teleprompter.
Oh, yeah.
He stumbled over so many of his lines today. We'll get to the substance. I'll get to the substance of what he said in a moment. But I'm saying, just from a simple evaluation of someone giving a speech, it was like he wasn't even trying. And he didn't even have to, because he had a captive audience. He started off with a couple of stupid jokes about, I need some 4X. And I would genuinely be surprised if he even knew what that was. He just read that on the teleprompter. And the two teleprompters were in frame, like Channel 9 were covering this live. They didn't even try and frame the shot so you couldn't see the teleprompters. They didn't. Like, you could literally see him just darting from teleprompter to teleprompter. And I'm sure many of our North American listeners are going, well, of course he does that. Well, you have to understand that we didn't get as much coverage of him here. I'm sure many people here still think that he's actually talking off the cuff or reading out memorized speeches. He's literally reading from teleprompters right in front of him that you can see in frame of the shot. I mean, it's so blatant. And yet, when he reads out a clearly scripted joke that he doesn't even understand, like, he doesn't even laugh at the punchline of his own joke. But it was almost like a laughter track in the audience.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I had some 4X. Ha! And then Obama was like, oh, yeah, that must be the funny part. That's how bad it was. And that's just discussing how he delivered it. Then when you get into the substance, Lindsay, I noticed the exact same thing that you noticed about him trying to undermine the idea that older people have wisdom to offer. No, you're the Obama youth. You're the climate change youth. And so he spent, 5 minutes buttering up the audience, then 10 minutes talking about how great Australia and America is and all that crap. And then once the audience was bored and the cuts to the audience showed like people, scratching their arms or playing with their phones, they'd already gotten bored of, hey, it's Obama. Then when he got to climate change, the applause again, like Pavlovian dogs, ringing the bell and they're salivating, climate change. And sure enough, and look, you wouldn't expect any different because these kids have all been brainwashed. And of course, it wasn't just university students in the audience. It was also high school kids selected from the different high schools around. And they're intentionally doing that for a reason. And then he had the cheek to get onto the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's when I decided there's nothing to cover at these protests, stuff that I'm going back to being a protester. So I grabbed my big placard that I made that's anti-Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I decided to wander on down to where I knew the motorcade was going to come through as soon as his speech ended. And of course, we'll go into more detail about his speech. I'm glad you brought up the point that you did, Lindsay. We'll go into greater detail about his speech tomorrow in a later episode. But we'll move on now to the police behavior, and I want to discuss what happened to me. So I grabbed my placard. As soon as Obama's speech finished, walked back down to Sir Fred Channel Drive, where I knew that the motorcade would be coming through again. And as I'm walking down the hill to get there, sure enough, all the lemmings are still lined up on the road to wave to Obama. Not a single one of them that I could see, and from my vantage point, I could see hundreds of meters down the hill either side. So of the hundreds of people who had lined up before and after his motorcade, not a single one had a placard for or against. They were just standing there to, wave their happy Obama, wave him a big wave and smile and whatever. I had my placard there, which just says, beware the TPP. Why isn't the media telling you, in big green and yellow writing on a black background, right? Nothing even threatening there, but just simple writing to get a message across. And normally when I take this out with me to protests, back when I used to think that protests, look, I've come a long way, okay, guys? Forgive listeners going, why would Johnno go to, look, guys, please, okay? Just bear with me here. I made the placard a long time ago, and now it looks cool hanging in my house, okay? But I thought, stuff it. No point covering the protest anymore. I'm going to get back. Someone has to say something about the TPP, especially when Obama has just buttered up our young kids and told them. He even said in the speech that they need the TPP for jobs and for building wealth and all this stuff. It was just, look, it was enough to make me pick up my placard. So I walked down to the where the motorcade's going to come through. And sure enough, there are 2 police holding up Ryan's Road, the road that I would walk towards to get to Sir Fred to make sure cars can't come for the motorcade. Fair enough. And straight away, I see the 2 police are looking at me because I'm the one guy with a placard, right? And I'm thinking, I know what they're going to do here. And before I had a chance to get out my old trusty spy cam, one of them walks up to me and says, have you registered that sign? That's what he said. Here is the exact words he said to me, is that sign registered? Now, this was not in the exclusion zone, okay? So he had no right to be treating me any different to how he should be treating me on any other day outside of G20. But even if I was inside the exclusion zone, there's no registering of signs. Do you understand what I'm saying here? We went into a lot of detail in previous episodes about the rights that police have because of G20. The point is, what he said made no sense in any way, shape, or form. And my natural reaction was to burst into laughter, which is exactly what I did. I wasn't trying to belittle the guy, but that was a genuinely comical thing to me. I burst out in laughter and said, mate, you don't register signs. Come on, man. And then I joined the huddle of people who were waiting in that particular little area on the road. And I think he was so surprised by that reaction that he left me alone. But he was the young constable. The guy on the other side of the road was like his senior because the 2 of them were working that road. And I could see that senior guy pointing to me saying, I can even overhear him saying, get that guy's details. And all I had done was carry a placard. Okay, these guys probably don't even know what the Trans-Pacific Partnership is. All they could read on that thing was beware. And that was enough to make them think, oh, well, this guy, let's hassle him. So sure enough, he kept telling me to get off the road. I wasn't on the road. So I whipped out the old spy glasses. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I thought it'd be handy to have some spy glasses for whatever purpose. And I just happened to have them with me at the time. So I put on the spy glasses, and I've got footage of once the motorcade went past and everyone dispersed, who was the one person they decided to walk up to and ask for his identification and do the bag search. Who was the one person? Well, it was your old mate, Johnno, and I captured every bit of it. So I'll be uploading that soon enough, and you can see all. And of course, during Obama's speech, what did he talk about? The voice that young people have in democratic values. And sure enough, as his motorcade goes past, the one guy who decides to exercise his right to say, I don't like the TPP and you should look into it, the one guy who does that, he's the one guy who gets asked for his details and for a bag search. That was one of 5 bag searches that I had today. And my only so-called crime was essentially a thought crime, carrying around a placard that said, beware the TPP. I had 2 searches today. And then tonight, after I went to Musgrave Park to see if anything was happening tonight, it wasn't. I decided to walk back to the city to get some public transport home. 3 bag searches in the space of an hour. 2 in one crossing across the river, and the Brisbane River is not a big river. Okay, it would normally be a 5-minute walk tops from one side of the bridge to the other side, walking slowly. That was enough space to get searched twice. Then I went to where I thought the bus stop was that had been closed for G20, unbeknownst to me. On the walk back to the ferry, another stop with the police. Now, I should say that the police behaved themselves in isolation as well as they behaved yesterday. They were pleasant. A couple of them even said, look, I'm Constable so-and-so. You know, this is just a bag search. You don't have to worry. They were very cordial and polite. But the point is, today, and I didn't have a megaphone. I didn't even have flyers. All I had was, and I only had the placard for the last 4 searches. The first one, I didn't even have a placard. 5 bag searches in one day, boys, which I think means that I am the leader for the weekend.
Yeah. Yep, I'm only at 3, so.
And Lindsay's
No, I didn't get anything.
Nothing.
Nobody came near me. No.
Well,
Lindsay disrespecting. Oh, man.
So to break up the poor listeners having to listen to me whinge about the police, I'll throw to you guys, based on what you just heard me say, what are your thoughts?
Oh, it's not a surprise. The first 2 days of the People's Summit, and yesterday I was being searched too. I only got searched 3 times, but I was just filming the police, and granted, on the second day I did have a shirt that probably provoked the police to think that I was trouble. But just searches, and again the police were nice and cooperative, and which for those people who live in Queensland know that's a surprise for the police. For most of the police, you know what I mean, they're acting normally during the time when they're predicted to not act the most normal. And just searches just for filming and for whatnot. And a lot of other people that I know that have been searched and probably had a bit more of a trouble because of larger bags and stuff. But I know my photographer AWAS, who is affiliated with TOTT News, he's been searched every day, because he was going and taking photos of the hotels that the people were staying in, and there was Secret Service all around these hotels and whatnot. But it doesn't surprise me. And Johnno gave me a ring saying, look, we'll have to do the podcast a little bit later because I'm not going to get around these police. They're everywhere. But not surprising. But Lindsay, you avoided it.
Yeah, I avoided it. I must be a good-looking fella or something. But anyway, it's just I think I told you I actually got to the stage where I took photographs of one of the anonymous blokes being booked and whatever, and I thought they'd just come after me for that. But no, nothing happened at all. There is an underlying point here. Even though they've been very pleasant, that's because they're under the spotlight. I mean, I and some friends of mine have come across some very belligerent Queensland police in the past when they're not under the spotlight. So they can be not very pleasant, with road stops and what have you. Having said that, they were pleasant, and I'm glad there was no violence to demonstrators or to police. We're all people underneath it all.
Yeah.
But I still think that we still can't let go of the fact that there were 6,000 police and they were herding us like cattle in our city, and they spent, $500 million? Sorry, $500 million.
Yes.
Yeah, $500 million.
Organising this. And I think before we were running down the organisers, I think we ought to start thinking about organising some sort of retaliation against the governments that set this up, whether it be elections or whatever, and let them know who the boss is. I think we need to do that because this really they were treating us like sheep. That was no other way of interpreting that.
Yeah, and I think it is to point out that most of these police were from interstate or from New Zealand, so it could very well be that most of the police we encountered weren't in fact Queensland police, and nothing really did have changed. It was just the interstate police that was basically on a vacation with this. But it's also important to point out that the protest didn't go completely smooth and everything. There was about a dozen arrests so far in the city. Kieran O'Reilly came back into the restriction zone. He got put on a prohibited persons list. I interviewed him on TOTT News about reasonable suspicion. and being persecuted for a political belief, pretty much. And he re-entered the zone. He got arrested. A supporter of him got arrested in the convention center who was yelling at the police and was told to get back. There was protesters. There was ladies arrested that were wearing gas masks or had gas masks in their possession. The climate change angels blocked the entrance to the Brisbane Convention and Exhibition Centre in South Bank, and Bill Shorten, our opposition leader, came out and talked to them because they demanded to talk to politicians, and they were only allowed to do that because they were for climate change. And that's exactly a really ironic thing there. But everything didn't go completely smooth. There was arrests, and there were people that were trying to, arc up at the police. But in terms of G20, there wasn't really anything that was completely unjustified that we can say, look, the police acted wrong here, because most of the arrests that they did were completely under their jurisdiction, and it was in every right for them to arrest these people. So, I'm pleasantly surprised and disappointed in terms of our response to the G20 and how we didn't make an impact, but everything went well.
But then coming, like we were talking about the other day with Sun Tzu and this strategic planning, we really should plan it so it's in our favour next time. I mean, it's useless trying to take them on when there's 6,000 of them, but next time around, when it's election or whatever else is going on, we should be able to plan it so it's in our favour, so that we dictate the battleground.
Yeah,
and it's on our rules.
Look, I don't disagree with you. I guess the point is G20 was the one chance, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Not just for Brisbane, for Australia.
Yeah.
And I think one of the points is that since 2007 and the GFC, which has wreaked havoc on so many economies, we've been relatively sheltered. And I think still so many people don't fully appreciate the changes that have taken place on this planet since then. Most people aren't aware that our banks have been pre-bailed into $380 billion. I mean, many people know that the American banks have bailed out, and even then they're like, well, if the economists support the bailout, most people are so clueless about what's going on. They don't even disagree with bailing out the banks, privatizing the gains and socializing the losses, let alone have any notion that we've already done that here in advance. Most people here just don't care enough, and the few who do care have all been funneled into caring about things which are important in their own right, but nowhere near first order issues. And so when you talk about we have to organise, we have to strategize, I'm not saying you're wrong, but who are we? I mean, who is the we now?
Yeah.
The resistance has been so, this is the point I made earlier, it's been so co-opted that I think if we're talking about a mass social movement or any kind of social movement, you almost have to go back to the drawing board and work out, well, what is there to work with and start from the ground up. I guess to look at the bright side, though, that's where these kinds of shows can be the catalyst. And I made the point on We'll Do It Live and on Mass Resistance, and I've made the point on this show. If we can get together and start a roundtable, if we can get together and start a podcast, the microphones, the USB microphones cost what, $100, $120? Most people have a computer, and YouTube is free, and it hasn't been shut down yet. Anyone can do this. So if anyone has any thoughts about this, you can start your own show. There's a whole audience waiting. We've already built up an audience. I checked the people, live listeners 10 minutes ago. We had live listeners in the double digits. Now, we only started this show 6 weeks ago, and when we started it, Ethan, we said if we get double digits listeners for the first few weeks in total, like total downloads per week, we'd be happy. But we've got double digits listeners live, and last night's show had 130 listeners. Now, why is that happening? Well, it's happening because our listeners are liking at least some of what we're saying, and they're sharing it, and their friends are sharing it. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And we've only been doing this show for 6 weeks. Now, if we can do that, any of our listeners can do that. If any of our listeners start doing their own show, send us a message on YouTube. We'll promote your show, and I'll listen to it. Yeah. I want to listen to people who are thinking for themselves. And the people that we heard at today's rallies aren't thinking for themselves. I mean, really, this goes to the heart of the whole matter. If the resistance, the protesters, aren't thinking for themselves, they might as well be the Courier Mail. They might as well be the G20 spokesman.
Exactly.
The problem is that there's such a small number of people who are thinking for themselves, and those people aren't in any kind of position of influence. Well, here's one way to influence, is to get yourself a microphone, get yourself a YouTube channel, and let's cross-promote it, because the guys in North America, they're doing that. And, hey, we've got ourselves an online community, and what we saw today was no kind of community. And that's the black and that's the white. You can look at the good and you can look at the bad, and that's where we're at right now.
Yeah. I'm just disappointed because this was it, you know what I mean? And I based on the way that the world's going with geopolitical issues, all this new anti-terrorism legislation, the fact that the Courier Mail were hyping it up so much that, the police state, all these draconian measures that were introduced, all of this, the catalyst of how, we're following how closely related we are to Canada in a lot of these issues and a lot of suppression of tyranny. to me, it just was natural to assume that this could have the potential to be like Toronto. And I'm happy that the marches went well and that the police were fantastic and whatnot. And to interject my own personal opinion, I'm disappointed in Brisbane because all we did was show them that we are, how controlled that we can be.
Yeah.
We were herded like little sheep through our little march route, and that was it. We ended up in the park, and then everyone went home. What sort of difference does that make? Now, I'm not inciting violence. I'm not encouraging violence. I'm not doing anything like that. But there are ways that you can try and make a difference and try to let the world know that here we are. And on an international scale, people looking at Brisbane, this was a pretty embarrassment for the resistance. Now, we can talk about that there is no resistance, that the resistance has been co-opted, that the real resistance is a very minority in this country, and then the rest are subconsciously controlled through their belief systems and through whatnot. But I still believe even through that Brisbane could have made a much bigger impact based on previous rallies that I've been to, that I've seen. Brisbane was one of the biggest venues in Australia. People used to travel up for Brisbane rallies. The Iraq War in 2003, all of these rallies, Brisbane was one of the main hubs in Australia, and we usually got our message across. This was just like I feared, the exact same as every march. It was just with more police and more pretext to be arrested and whatnot, and all these draconian measures. And even though the police were nice, we still have to say that it's troubling that these laws were introduced for them to take advantage of if they wanted, that all of this equipment most likely isn't going to disappear from them once.
Well, it's almost like an ambit claim. An ambit claim is where you say, well, we want you to give us this amount. They come back to you with a counter offer, you meet in the middle that you always expected to get. You never expected to get the ambit claim. Yeah. It's very much the same thing with the police state. They introduce a police state, and I mean, I've got footage from today of 4 police officers at one ferry stop, okay? A ferry stop with maybe a dozen people waiting for a boat to go down the river, 4 police waiting there. Now, they're not going to be for their post G20, but they're getting us used to it. So if they make the ambit claim of police everywhere, and look how brutal they're going to be because we have to stop what happened in Toronto, and then they're all nice to us, which the police at an individual have been nice, then we say, well, we don't mind that there's a police state so long as they're friendly to us. And then all they have to do one day is stop being friendly. Hey, you with the placard, we don't just want your license. We're not. And they took photos of my placard as well, which, look, I wasn't at all scared or threatened by the police today because they have been so polite to us. And we gave the police, on the individual level, plenty of credit last night, okay? So we're not a police bashing group. We're not a police criticizing group. Bashing just means criticizing in Australian vernacular. I don't know if that's going around the world. Just wanted to make that clear. We're not here just to criticize the police. On an individual level, they were fine. But we are still talking about a police state where carrying a placard is going to get them to take your details 5 times. And you have to always ask yourself why. Always ask yourself, don't just assume that people are doing something for no reason. Okay? If you assume that people are doing things for no reason, that's probably because you do things for no reason, because you're stupid. Well, guess what? The people who run the show aren't. So ask yourself, what are they trying to do? Why would you want to harass a dude who's carrying around a placard 5 times? That can be enough to put people off doing it. Yeah. And that's all they want, you see? So in a way, I think when we look at the media, we covered the media in the weeks leading up to this, where they were like, anarchists coming, ferals coming, let's destroy all the protesters, whatever. Even if they didn't do that in the end, they've put that idea into people's minds that that's why they needed the police presence. And look, I haven't had people today tell me, like I asked them, so what do you think about your tax dollars supporting all of these police that clearly weren't needed? And I had someone say to me, yeah, but why weren't they needed? It was deterrence, you see. So people are already like that's just one example, but I can assure you that's going to be the case amongst many people. They're internalizing the idea that the more police that we have, the better off they are. That to them, that actually makes sense.
No, I agree. It was just unique. It was unique in the way that it was good and bad at the same time, and there's a lot of contradictions in between. And personally, I'm more in the disappointment boat, and that's just me because I am I'm a human being, and there is evil people in the same city as me. It makes me nauseated to think that President Obama is in the same city as me at the moment. And this was our platform to get our message across as the people, and it didn't resonate.
Yeah, and here's my question to you two. What do you think was the one image, if all the protests did get one image or one idea out there to G20 leaders or to the world, what was the one message that resonated? it was G20 side, it was genocide, it was the Indigenous Australians saying that there was a genocide taking place today. I'm not here to say whether that's true or not. The point is, that's the one image they're going to go away from. That's an image that still paints the average Australian in a bad light. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Our biggest message as protesters or as resistance to the G20, so far as, this is my opinion, so far as I can tell from the protest, the one good thing, the one message that did get through that you could say was a message that casts every single person at this table and pretty much every Australian in a bad light. That was the most that we achieved. You know what I mean? That's looking at things from the protest and from what happened on the ground. We'll spend more time tomorrow looking at Obama's speech and Cameron's speech and, you know, the communique, they call it a communique at the end of the G20, what all the countries agreed to. We'll look at the technical details of the G20, you know, the political, if you want to use that term, aspect. I guess today we've really just talked about the protest, what I call the intellectual resistance, all the rest of it. And I think it's been good to have this roundtable. We don't have notes in front of us today. Normally we come with notes and we're very structured in what we say. This conversation that we've had now, we've done it live. We didn't even have this chat before the show. This was really just, and of course we all split up today too. We all went in different ways to cover different things. When we saw what I thought might be the police getting ready to kettle us when they broke out into one police every 5 or 10 meters, I thought more police will arrive soon. So I went outside of the police lines from a vantage point. And then from that point, we split up. So we had different perspectives today, and we've come together today. What could be our biggest roundtable in terms of honesty and just putting out what we think on the table? You know, I think this has been a cathartic experience after what I'm sure many of our viewers have probably attuned to was a somewhat disappointing day.
Yeah, it was. It was. And for, you know, the way that we've been talking about it, the expectations and whatnot, and then the G20 went off just like any other march that's happened in Brisbane, and the message isn't resonating across. And those Ethiopian protesters, they were the loudest protesters I think I can recall ever seeing. They were loud and they just did not stop. When we got to Musgrave Park, they went down in the little shade area and they were continuously going, you know what I mean? They were facing the convention centre. No, they had their passion behind it. So did the Indigenous people. But as again, the bubbles are in one big bubble.
Yeah.
That the G20 and this corporate fascist control that we have, it's all in one big bubble, and they're going to walk away with, you know, Indigenous issues, which, I don't know. I'm just disappointed.
Now, on our rough rundown, I did say that we'd finish the show by giving our general thoughts on the protest movement. We've kind of interwoven that into the other topics that we've talked about. Now, we've got one more day of official G20 tomorrow. My understanding is that even as far as the official G20 goes, today is the biggest day, and tomorrow is essentially tying up all the loose ends and getting ready for the leaders to fly out. But we are still planning to do a big show tomorrow that we'll probably get to start a bit earlier because, I mean, look how early things finished today. Things are probably going to finish very early tomorrow. We'll have time to get back and do a probably more slightly structured show. But we do have one more day. We finished yesterday with our predictions on the following day. We haven't even sat down and discussed our plans as citizen journalists or as protesters, what we're going to do tomorrow. Lindsay, at this point in time, based on what's come over the last couple of days, what are your plans for tomorrow? What are your expectations for tomorrow?
Once again, I think I've said this every night. I have no expectations because it's just exactly what happened today. You know, I have no idea what's going to happen. But based on today, I think it would probably go downhill and be a bit of a fizzer tomorrow.
Yep.
My first plan, I've got to get up early and do 2 loads of washing. That's the first thing I've got to do. And then after that, then I'll probably rock into town and just see what's going on. No, that's about it.
Yeah. No, I don't even know if I'll actually be heading in. You know, this is my 4th day out in the sun all day, and I'm pretty wrecked. Been editing most nights till early in the morning. I'm just wrecked. The G20's taken its toll on me. It's a fantastic experience. You know, we got to cover a G20. The G20 came to Brisbane. I'll probably head out and because very well, you know, tomorrow the police could just snap like that. You know what I mean? Could just completely change direction, and then all of the things we've said could happen. You never know. You can't predict it. But I don't see it happening. I don't see that they would even need a reason to. You know what I mean? The people behind them instructing them would be like, you don't even need to do that. We've got them as controlled as we want to. But my plans, I'm just going to see what happens. I'm going to go with the flow rather than try and be as organised as I have as the G20 is concluding. And it was a very, dismal, somewhat exciting, somewhat of a great experience / disappointing G20. It was very unique and something that most people are going to look back in history and feel the same thing.
Yeah, and you've been doing phenomenal work out in the field. Obviously, I spend most of the week inside with doing my guest spots and other shows and what have you, so I haven't been out in the field as much as you have. Your work has been phenomenal, Ethan. I do have a question for you, though, mate. How is it that you're wearing short sleeves right now, and today you're wearing long sleeves, but half of your arms are sunburned? What? He's got two-tone arms here. He's got white skin above the elbow and red skin below the elbow, but none of the clothes you wore today should have turned out. What on earth happened?
They're plotting against me. Oh, I got out there today and my mic wouldn't work. My mic didn't work. The batteries I charged all night for the camera were on almost empty. My phone was almost on empty that I charged all night. Everything that could have gone wrong for me went wrong. I forgot my Go card, everything. It was just terrible. So it's a story of my life that something like that could have happened. I'm probably sunburnt, on the upper of my legs, I was wearing suit pants out in the heat,
I did have another question I wanted to ask you. Obviously, you're pretty well networked with other citizen journalists here in Brisbane, and even myself over the last week or two, have met a few who are doing their own work. We've given our feedback on what we've seen and the things, the footage that we've got and stuff that we're ready to upload over the coming days. The people that you spoke to today, I mean, we've given our feedback as 3 people, and we have different views because we spent much of today and yesterday apart. The feedback that you're getting from other citizen journalists based on what they've seen today and yesterday, can you give us an idea of what the general feeling is amongst the citizen journalist community here in Brisbane?
Most of them feel the same way that I do, that it was, sort of a contradiction of thoughts and feelings, Some were doing phenomenal work, you know what I mean? Some were doing interviews and everything that I wanted to do, but circumstances didn't allow me to today, even though everything worked for the rest of it. Doing great work. Some were more radical, saying that we needed to make a more radical influence. Some were saying that this was a really great march and was really great for Brisbane and we really, made a difference today. And others, it was sort of just as separated and ununified as the protest march itself, was the thought between the citizen journalists. So in terms of wrapping up the entire G20 summit, that's what it was. It was just so many different thoughts, so many different contradictions. And
well, that brought me back to when you said that before about having this evil man in my city.
Yeah.
It reminded me of a woman on the television before saying, "Oh, if I shook Barack Obama's hand, I wouldn't wash for a week."
Oh, my goodness.
No, and I thought,
well, this, I tell
no, she said that.
like, well, I take this is, this is my city. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're some of the leading tip of the iceberg per se. Not to be arrogant, but in terms of citizen media and resistance in this city, this is our city. And for this to be such a dismal display where nothing was got across, I feel disappointed in that personally, because all of these evil people that I spend most of my time opposing and trying to expose and trying to, benefit a community of like-minded people by exposing this information, we had no real impact to these people. And that, I feel that just because of the way I am, I feel that reflects back on me. You know what I mean? Because they've come to my city, and what did I do about it? What have we done about it? So, I don't know. This will be a learning experience for me.
And what I've noticed with some of the people doing good work in North America, say Jeff C and the Otter Expositor and these people, is, they've had this problem lately with all their false flags. We just had the one recent false flag with that Newman Hater incident down in southeastern Melbourne. And of course, listeners can go back to episode 1 or 2 where we touched on just some of the anomalies of that whole story. In North America, there's been this year, there's just been so many blatant psyops and false flags. And what I've noticed is once it happens in one of those citizen, they're YouTubers. I don't think they call themselves citizen journalists, but they're people who cover the truth in the same way that we like to think that we do. And when it happens in their city, you can see a change in the way they cover it. It goes from being, hey, let's look at the facts and let's look at how they're lying to us, to a genuine feeling of, hey, well, this is my city that you're doing this to. And I guess that's probably how we all felt leading up to the G20. It was certainly one of the things that made me want to do a podcast, was to say, hey, look, we're going to be some of the very few people in Brisbane who, A, know that the mainstream media is complete bunkum, and B, have the capacity to discuss that in the manner that we do. And so we're kind of obliged to do it. And I suppose with the G20 being in Brisbane, this was our time to try and cover it and to spread the truth and to be surrounded by so many people who are so far gone down there's a rabbit hole, whatever the opposite of the rabbit hole is, wherever it is that what we call education systems and the mainstream media, wherever it is that's trying to send you, there are so many people who are so far down that place. It doesn't matter how at peace you are with the truth or the fact that that's what's motivating you to work. I think it's very natural for people when it's their city that's affected, whether it's a false flag like in Ottawa recently, and the Ottawa Expositor had a fantastic video immediately following that saying that not in my city. You want to do this, the nonsense that you guys do it anyway, but you want to do it in my city. This time, it's personal. And I guess for us, that's what it's been. We know that the people out there are lemmings. If you said to me 6 months ago, Obama's going to come to Australia, what do you think people are going to do? I'd say they're going to jump over each other for a ticket to see him, and they're going to line up like lemmings to see a motorcade go past, which may or may not be a dummy in the limo. And some of them will even not, may or may not be a dummy. It doesn't matter. They'll still go. You could tell them this motorcade is a 1 in 4 chance of being the real Obama, and they'd still go because they want to be at Obama's motorcade. We could have all predicted that. But when you see it up front, you wouldn't be human to not feel a little bit of, oh man, really? You know what I mean? Like on the ferry on the way home from the city, when I finally got onto the public transport after all the police searches holding me back, when I finally got onto the ferry, I'm the one dude with a placard, you know what I mean? And most of these people weren't at protests, so they shouldn't have had placards, but I'm the one person who was shown any interest in doing anything like that. And what are the conversations that I'm overhearing people talk about? Oh, Obama really has, he's really shown up Abbott with his talk of climate change. And like, they're just buying into the net. Like it is Pavlovian dog stuff. And when you're sitting there or standing there on a ferry on the way home, that's always going to affect you more than it would affect you just, reviewing this from afar. Lindsay.
Yeah. No, I agree. I must confess that I tend to think of myself as in a war with these people. Perhaps I've been doing it a bit longer or something. And to me, today is just another battle, and it probably wasn't the right ground for us to fight them. I'm looking towards, like I'm just sitting here before thinking about it, and I thought, if we went through and we actually pinned down and took down the handful of pedophiles in this government, that would stuff them up. I mean, we know there are pedophiles in their system. If we even just took down a handful of pedophiles in them, that would bugger them up. That would be a better way of attacking them than doing a march down the street, because it would embarrass hell out of them and might affect them at the next election. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking about. Now, I don't know whether that's practical or not, but that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of. Find their weakness, attack it. Don't think of it as a battle. We're going to pick our ground where we'll have the high ground, and it's going to go on forever until I die. There's going to be war. That's the way I view it. I'm not trying to push my ideas onto you, but that's how I view it now.
I fully understand that.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking of in terms of making an influence. We need to get these people like this, and I'm from this. Even though the G20 was not what we expected to, I'm still going to come back with more. I'm still going to make a video and reports on how the mainstream media completely lied to you, used sensationalist hype to scare everyone out of the city, to say the anarchists are coming, just to sell newspapers and to serve an agenda, to subconsciously put the police state into people's heads to oppose, the protesters, that they're bad, that they're ferals, and that it's not, even though the police were nice, the laws were still introduced, the catalyst for a police state was still there. So I'm still going to flip it back on them to say, look, the mainstream media openly lied, because that's not what happened. All of this expenditure was completely unnecessary and could have gone into so much better putting back into our society, even though they would deliberately try to, exploit that and not to do that. And, to continue that, to expose the powers that be, saying that they do that for a reason, that they spend, $500 million on things like that. So I'm still going to flip it back on them, even though we didn't really make an impact today. So it goes back to what you're saying about this is just one step in a larger picture, and we need to continue.
You've learned a lot today.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. So no, I think that's positive. We've learned. We'll now plan for what we're going to do next, and through this medium, you'll probably find there are people out there who are listening who would come on side once there's something new coming.
Look, I'm glad you say that, because I should have said at the start of the show just how thankful I am personally. I can't speak for you two, for the listeners.
Yeah.
I got home tonight to find that 130 times last night's show had already been listened to. That's not our friends doing that. That is our friends, but it's our listener friends who are spreading this. And I think it's probably worth trying to finish the show on a more positive point.
Yeah.
If what's happening on the ground looks like it might not have a lot of potential there moving forward, and that's how I see it. If the resistance being co-opted, it's been co-opted. You've got to not just arrest that momentum going the wrong way, then you've got to get it going back the right way. That's doubly hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's on the ground here in Brisbane. What we have online is something very, very different. And on that front, things are getting better with every week. At the moment, literally with every day.
Yeah.
So I can't say thanks enough personally to all of our listeners who are spreading it. Whether you're listening and you're just putting it on your Facebook, or whether you're listening and you're sending an email to a friend saying, hey, check these guys out. Or you're listening and you've got a friend in real life and you've said to them, hey, do you want to listen to these people with me live? I think the stuff that they're doing is cool. However you're spreading the message about our show, I can't be more thankful for it, because you're doing terrific work. And I hope that if even 1 out of 10 of our listeners decide, hey, if Johnno and Ethan and Lindsay were just regular guys who just like to read books and history and really talk about how that applies to today, because that's what we do essentially.
Yeah.
If they just want to apply some common sense to what's happening, if they can do it, why can't I? Well, I'm telling you, there's no reason why you can't. And I hope that you do. And if we can get 130 people listening to us within the space of 24 hours, 6 or 7 weeks after our first show, well, anyone can do that. And the more shows that do this, the easier it's going to get for everyone. So if you're listening to this show, you don't have to agree with everything we say. In fact, I would hope that you wouldn't. We don't even agree as a panel. I mean, and because tonight hasn't been structured, there's been more disagreement, and that's healthy. This is the way it should be. But if you like the idea of not trusting the mainstream media, not trusting the prevailing paradigm, there has never been a better time to get into doing your own shows. And the reason why is because of the stuff that David Cameron was talking about when he addressed our parliament, as we discussed in last night's episode. They're going to try to shut down the internet. They're going to try to shut down the internet because they've already shut down what's happening on the ground, in my opinion. They've co-opted.
Yeah, definitely.
But what they haven't co-opted is this show. What they haven't co-opted is shows like We'll Do It Live and Max Resistance. And they're not going to be able to co-opt them, not nearly as easily as they've co-opted what happens on the ground. This is our one avenue to really, if we think we can make a change, this is the avenue to do it. Now, I've said from the start, I'm not trying to make a change with the show. I'm here for the people who are already awake. But other people who want to wake people up or who want to make a difference, the internet is ours for the time being. So while we've got it, we have to use it.
Yeah.
Now, we've almost pushed out to the full 90 minutes. We always finish with our final thoughts. I'll grab yours, Lindsay's first. Any final thoughts before we sign off on the show tonight?
No, when I was talking a minute ago, I think I pretty much summed up what I had to say. So there's not much to add to that.
And we'll see you again tomorrow for our big review of the G20. See how I've tried to put a positive spin on my voice now. Tune in tomorrow, guys. All right, so Lindsay, we'll see you tomorrow. Again, we can't promise the viewers what time we're going to go to air because it just depends on what happens tomorrow. But hopefully it'll be probably a little bit closer to 4 p.m. than we have been the last couple of nights, just because we don't expect much to happen tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Yep.
And Ethan, any final thoughts for tonight before we sign off?
On a positive note, speaking on our viewers, we did meet someone at the rally today who come up and recognised us or our voices and said, "Hey, I listened to your podcast." So that's just something there that is saying that, people are out there that are like-minded. There is a community. So if you want to start your own podcast, we encourage this guy to start his own podcast.
Actually, you're quite right. A bloke came up to us today and said, you guys are the ones who do the roundtable. And he was a big fan of your work on TOTT News, Ethan. And it's probably worth plugging your channel again because there aren't many people covering G20 for what it really is. So if the listeners want to get more information, articles, not just people talking, but articles and videos, check out TOTT News because you've got new articles every day covering the G20.
Yeah. We've got 2 major articles. We're going to post the one from the rally today. We've got the entire duration of the People's Summit over the 3 days. More videos and interviews are going to be uploaded. It's just the G20 has been hectic and there's not a lot of time to fit everything in. But tottnews.com and youtube.com/TOTT News, the independent alternative media in Australia, and we're trying to, try and get past the mainstream media spin and deception. And once again, thanks to all the viewers and listeners of all of the work that we do.
You're getting more smooth with your TOTT plugs with every. We're slowly getting there. Look, my final thought before we sign off is I should have made this more clear earlier when I was criticising the leaders of the Indigenous groups and their speakers. The point I want to make is this. What we need is harmony between all of the peasants, white, black, and Chinese and everything. We are the peasantry. We're the 85, 90, whatever percent it is now of the people who have no real power, who are serfs. What we need is harmony. And you know who would be the best people to lead that kind of thing? Well, that'd be the Indigenous people, because a lot of their people have been raised to hate us. And if you're a white Australian or a non-Indigenous Australian, you might not be familiar with just how much hatred there is there. In fact, this has been an eye-opening thing for me spending time in Musgrave Park. There's a lot of hatred there. And you can argue whether that's right or wrong, but it's there. What we need is I think what would be fantastic for the movement of what I call the peasantry would be to have an Indigenous person, because they're not going to have that hate coming at them straight away. And if someone could unify all of us, white, black, and otherwise, say, hey, if you're a white person, your enemies aren't the blacks. If you're a black person, your enemy isn't the white. If you're anything between, we're all in this together. Our real enemies aren't at this park. They're not at this rally. They're a kilometre away in that building, laughing at how easy it is to divide us. The problem isn't the Indigenous people. The problem was simply the method they used to get across their message today. As soon as there comes along someone who can unify us all, that'll be a game changer. And I think I might have met someone like that today. So there's still plenty of hope in the air, guys. Thanks to all the viewers for tuning in tonight. We'll be back again tomorrow. We can't tell you what time. Again, this is assuming that there's no arrest, but touch wood, I'm starting to think the chances are slim.
Yeah.
We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for everyone for tuning in. This is the Australian Roundtable live, Lindsay. We'll be back again tomorrow, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.